I wanted to get tonight's lecture series kicked off and this whole season's lecture series started. On behalf of the Board of Directors and our new Executive Director, I would like to welcome you to the 18th Annual ReShaping Rochester Lecture Series. And as I said before, after several years of meeting virtually, it is good to be here in person with everybody. My name is Bill Price, and I'm President of the Board of Directors for the Community Design Center. And I wanted you to know that this year we have established our theme as Then and Now. Although it is our 18th lecture series season, this is our 20th year. The center was officially incorporated in 2003, so we are celebrating our 20th year, 2 decades. So the series this year being Then and Now, again, 20 years of history. We did decide with this year's theme to invite back speakers who have been here with us before, and many of whom you all have heard before in the past. In the past 3 years, as we all know, we've lived through a serious health situation in the world. We have, much more social awareness of a lot of important topics, and we have faced and are still facing economic conditions that continue to affect us every day. And the world of urban planning, of urban design, master planning, and the design of the public realm as it affects our neighborhoods and the quality of our life is all impacted by what's happened here in the last 3 or 4 years. So bringing back some of our previous speakers who spoke with us before all these things happened, to give us a fresh perspective on what's worked well since they were here last time and what still needs some work. So as I said before, the Design Center was founded in 2003. Before that, it was actually a committee of the American Institute of Architects. We are led by design professionals. We were founded by design professionals, but we are no longer solely led by design professionals. We recognize that more than designers, engineers, architects, planners contribute to placemaking and to developing cities and managing the public realm. So we have broadened the base of people who are on our board to those who include lawyers, accountants, and other people who are well-versed in how to make their neighborhoods better. So we've really broadened our horizons as well. Our board of directors include this cast of characters. Our immediate past president is Monica McCullough, myself, Stephanie Annunziata, Vanessa Villano, Howard Decker, Jean Dupre, who you heard on WXXI Connections with Evan Dawson today, along with Ellen. Nice job, Jean. Eugenio Marlin is here tonight. Welcome, Eugenio. Michael Pratico, Pamela Reese-Smith, Miriam Jacob. Miriam was a local architect and is still on our board, but works out of Boston. So the powers of virtual communications have paid off with Miriam. And Tanya Weiland makes up the rest of our board. We want to thank the Council on the Arts, New York State, for 18 years of support of the Design Center and this lecture series. Couldn't do it without them. This is our circle of giving. These are folks who have contributed $500 or more to the Design Center on an annual basis, and we thank each and every one of these folks. I'd like to give a big thanks to our gold sponsor, ESL. Again, every year they seem to step up and contribute and help us out, and they they do agree with our mission, and they understand our philosophy, and it aligns with theirs and their foundation, and they have contributed generously, and we want to thank them. Our other partners and sponsors, the Memorial Art Gallery, this is the first time we have presented in this auditorium, and we have struck a very nice partnership with the Memorial Art Gallery, and they are helping support us by considering this a program of the MAG as well as a program of the Community Design Center. Courtyard by Marriott is offering accommodations to our speakers this year. M&M Development, Monica McCullough, Havron and the company is Stephanie Annunziata's firm. Our exclusive media partner is WXXI, and AIA Rochester and APA Rochester chapters for providing continuing ed credits for design professionals. This is the obligatory slide that if you are a planner and you're expecting to get some credits for attending tonight, you guys please read it, and there, you're done. Okay. All right, I will introduce Ellen Dunham-Jones. And I told her that I would make this speech a little bit shorter than it is on this piece of paper. Ellen is a professor of architecture and directs the Masters of Urban Design at Georgia Institute of Technology. She first spoke here in 2010, so we've had 12 years since Ellen has been here. She is an authority on sustainable suburban redevelopment. She maintains a unique database of over 2,000 suburban retrofit projects, hosts the Redesigning Cities podcast series, was the Architectural Records 2018-19 Woman Educator of the Year, and was recognized in 2017 by Planetizen. I mess that word up every time. Planetizen, good website, I can't pronounce it, as one of the 100 most influential urbanists of all time. She has written 2 books with her co-author, June Williamson. Both of these books are award-winning books and well-recognized, and we'll probably hear a little bit about both of those efforts here tonight. Ellen is a fellow of the Congress for the New Urbanism, as well as the Brooke Byers Institute of Sustainable Systems. She lectures widely, conducts workshops and research on many benefits of retrofitting, as well on the potential urban design impacts of autonomous vehicles. She has served on several national committees, and she has a BS and a Master's of Architecture degree from Princeton University, and has practiced for over 20 years, taught at University of Virginia, MIT, before being recruited to Georgia Institute of Technology, Georgia Tech. I would like to welcome back, after 12 years, Ellen Dunham-Jones.
Thank you very, very much. That was lovely, Bill, and it really is just an honor to be able to kick off your Then and Now and to be welcomed back. So since 2010, the number of suburban retrofits actually has exploded. We only had 80 case studies when we wrote the first book, and now I really can't keep up. I mean, there's well over 20, we're even, I think, up to about close to 2,500 at this point. It's just, there's a lot going on. I promise I won't bore you with all 2,500 examples, but it might feel like it, just a little warning. So we wrote, there were just, the retrofits have been getting more and more ambitious and much better designed, and that was why we felt we had to write a sequel. So tonight, I really am going to focus that much more kind of on this sequel, which really is organized around these sort of 6 urgent challenges that the suburbs were never designed for. Disrupting auto dependence, that was really the whole goal. That's probably all I talked about pretty much back in 2010. That's still really important, but nowadays, communities are increasingly saying, well, while you reduce auto dependence, what are you doing to improve public health, support an aging population, leverage social capital for equity, compete for jobs, and climate change, the big one, add water and energy resilience. So we made a point of, we just tried to select a broad group of case studies that would show what are really the three basic strategies of retrofitting. Redevelopment is what most communities want, because that'll build their tax base, but you don't always, if you don't have a growing population, you don't necessarily want to redevelop someplace into another mixed-use town center if it's going to actually pull people away from your existing centers. So often it can make more sense to simply re-inhabit that existing box with much more community-serving uses. And I'll show a bunch of examples, and there's loads more. And then the third strategy that, frankly, in my opinion, doesn't happen enough is re-greening, when we really never should have built there in the first place. So I'll run through a bunch of these. Now, I think this audience, you guys, I don't have to tell you the difference between urban and suburban form. You can read this if you want, but when I talk about retrofitting suburbia, I really could care less about the municipal designations. To me, it's all about retrofitting suburban form to be a more urban form. And there are plenty of cities that have suburban form, and there are plenty of suburbs that have actually great little historic Main Street and some good bones of good urban form that should be expanded upon. So I'm also I'll talk a little bit about just, what's driving the retrofitting of suburbia. And you can read the slides here, but a lot of it is just so much of what we built in this post-World War II, it's aging and it's not aging well. And especially the commercial properties. We just have more and more now. The retail properties in particular have really been hit first by online shopping, then by COVID. Climate change is also giving us, the suburbs were never designed around, nobody was really thinking about sustainability back in the day. We suddenly have really different ways of working and getting around, given all the digital communication, telework, teleshopping, teleeducation, telemedicine. And perhaps the one that is often not recognized nearly enough, I think, is just how much demographics are changing, and really quite dramatically. The suburbs were generally designed for young families. That was the assumption, was you wanted to really build new starter homes for new households. And yet today, the majority of the population in the suburbs are older adults. The kids are long since gone, and there are, even just nationally, just the sheer numbers of, we have more older adults than kids increasingly, and that's having, we hear about the labor shortage and we kind of think, oh, that's related to COVID. No, that's actually systemic. That's demographics. COVID has just accelerated some of the shift. We also, the majority, is close to 80% of all urbanized land in the US is zoned exclusively for single-family homes, and yet the majority of US households are now 1- or 2-person households. We just keep shrinking in the size of our households, and there's a real mismatch, and that especially comes to play in suburbia. And more Americans in poverty live in suburbs than in cities. That's been true since 2005, even before the recession. It's even more now. Shrinking middle class, new market preferences. All in all, it's leading to, I think, a change in pretty strong shifts in the preferences and the needs that we're seeing. So these are sort of the national trends. But what about Rochester? You guys know Rochester way better than I do. I do not pretend to really know that much about your city and region. But what I've heard is that many of you are somewhat, especially in this audience, you've been coming to these lectures for 18 years, and you're frustrated that there hasn't been quite as much embrace of urbanism. I think there's some great projects in Rochester. The downtown, the loop refilling is I think is absolutely fantastic, and other examples too. But there's a sense a little bit of Rochester, too many of the communities opposing multifamily, and too many of the suburbs really not interested or willing to promote a more urban lifestyle. So I'm going to show, and I think you add on to that, we have this pretty serious threat of a recession coming. Hopefully, if it comes, it's mild, but so there's a lot of uncertainty in the development world right now. And so I will show a few really ambitious, big project retrofits, but I'm also going to show a lot more that are kind of simpler, little fast, easy, cheap, kind of easier to do kinds of things. And I hope they'll be useful. So job one, as I said, is still disrupt auto dependence. And there's a whole lot of strategies. You guys have all heard about the need for walkability, multimodal systems. I want to also draw a little of attention just to, I'm fascinated by how much on-demand microtransit van taxi service is really helping expand public transit systems out to low-density areas where that's never been feasible before. So there's actually new opportunities for transit. And we really need all that because the typical suburban house is generating 9.4 trips a day, and yet 46%, almost half of those trips, are less than 3 miles, which really could be a reasonable bike ride in good weather by healthy people. So not everybody's going to do that. But if we just had more sidewalks and bike lanes, almost half of trips could be. And e-bikes now really make it so much easier. So lots of opportunities. Sometimes it can be as simple as changing an intersection. This is a great project, very much led by the city in Washington, D.C., where the existing intersection shown on the upper left, really looked almost like a highway intersection. These curving roads designed for cars to going super high speeds, not stopping at the intersection at all. Absolutely really a mess for pedestrians to try to cross the road. And this is a dense, majority African-American neighborhood and happens to be right near a transit station. So the planning director said, I want that intersection to be made a 90-degree basic stop sign intersection. And in the process, capture all those traffic islands, all that public land, which is now being redeveloped with mostly very affordable housing. So over there on the far right are apartments above a Walmart, connecting affordable housing, affordable retail, and affordable transit, kind of all in one fell swoop. Finding available public land is actually a really terrific strategy. And most of us just don't know or think where it really is. This one is, I think, an interesting example of also just sometimes the market isn't yet ready for full-on urbanism out in the suburbs. So that was the case here in Englewood, about 9 miles outside of Denver. A big mall died, and so the left side of it has some urbanism, a big plaza. It's actually at a new transit stop. But on the right-hand side, there's a Walmart, and at the bottom, a whole bunch of outlying outparcels. The city asked Walmart, they said, look, can you design your parking lots as future building sites? Don't put your sewer hookup diagonally underneath the parking lot to the closest hookup. Put the sewers in the drive lanes. And Walmart said, we'll go one better. We'll even put some trees along the drive lanes. So those parking lots are still there right now. It's 20 years later, 22, but they are designed to be future building sites. So when the market's not yet there, what is interesting is that now, 20 years later, the out parcels were all on a ground lease that the city owned. And now that the transit system has built out, there's a lot more interest in living close to on the transit, and now those parcels are being redeveloped at much higher density. So we'll see what happens with the Walmart. So, parking is just part of how you reduce automobile dependency is by building on the parking lots, but is also just making walking so much more aesthetically attractive, and sometimes it's about screening the parking lots. Liner buildings are a terrific little strategy. Up at the top, Mashpee Commons, which was in our first book, I probably talked about it in 2010. Mashpee Commons makes use of these little skinny, deliberately too skinny for chain store retail. These are their incubator, the little green boxes up there. Incubator retail just specifically for local merchants, but they screen the parking lots. They make the street feel now like it is a double-loaded retail street, which always helps retail perform better. And they have a high churn rate because not every local retailer is successful. But they also generate some of the highest sales per square foot. Below is another example, not with retail, but using little apartments to screen a parking lot. So this parking lot here, the aerial view, shows the after, but underneath it, what the before was the same parking lot, but with cars right underneath that. So the 20-foot depth, essentially, of a parking space, they just simply elevated and put apartments up above. When you can sort of see on the sidewalk here, that's open air. You're looking right at the cars. The cars are just parking right underneath those the apartments. Super affordable, just a little way to dramatically improve the pedestrian experience on the street. Now, part of this, though, is also, I think, how do you make all of this pay off? And I've been extremely impressed in Carmel, Indiana, where the Mayor Jim Brainerd uses one of the more common in almost all retrofits. We want the infrastructure to be publicly owned. And so tax increment financing is a very common tool that's used to do that. He uses it specifically to build underground parking. No one else. In suburbia, land is still relatively cheap, and nobody else builds underground parking on cheap land. But by doing so, that lets the developers actually maximize the use of the property and completely fill it with, both of these cases, with apartments. that would never have been able to fit a parking garage and the apartments on what were just little fast food sites. And he's by allowing the developers to build in that way, he's both getting terrific perimeter frontage all the way around. There's no surface parking lots, completely replacing those surface parking lots. And the property tax values are more than 20 times what they were. He's paying off, TIP bonds are typically 25 years. He's paying them off, typically they're being paid off in Carmel in less than 5 because of this strategy. And now all the underground parking is free because it was publicly paid for. This is, there's lots of different ways that this stuff happens. So I'm sort of pointing out, here's an example of a city-led redevelopment of commercial property into a small city's downtown around a town green. So little suburban town, Burien, outside of Seattle. And it took them a very long time. But the city started with a little road diet on the street in front just to reduce all the width of the street, put in more parking. Then they put a street grid sort of through and around a little green at the center. And eventually, and they got hit with, they timed it terribly in terms of the recession. But they've now, it's been extremely, they finally have sort of finished it off. It's been extremely successful, and really by sticking to the vision. These things don't happen overnight, and especially in small towns. Nobody's got the money to make it all happen quickly, but they're great examples like this. Now, when they're developer-led, they tend to happen much more quickly. This one was one in the first book, and it's still a fascinating one to watch as it's been evolving. This was a 100-acre mall that when the mall died, today it's 22 blocks with public streets, very walkable, very connected with the neighboring areas around it. It tripled density on the site, but they did not have to widen any additional roads because it's mixed use and it's capturing so many of the trips that otherwise would have been made by car. It's served by bus lines, and it is generating 4 times the tax revenue of the mall at its peak. So it's really been quite fascinating. Now this one is now getting on the older side. It's been around a while, and actually during COVID, the retail went bankrupt. It was immediately bought up, and I'm waiting to see what happens. But what's interesting with this, it exemplifies sometimes a challenge with these projects. The restaurants, I've been to this project, I've visited it over the years many, many times. If you go at lunch, the restaurants, the music is quiet, it's comfort food, and it's full of mostly seniors who live in the surrounding suburbs coming to have lunch. At cocktail hour, the music goes up. It is the younger folks coming and having dinner and sort of rocking out. And they're the folks who actually live, many of them are living in Belmar. There's actually now also some senior housing at that Blue Star, so it's got a mix of ages. But the restaurants can do that. They can adjust their menu and their music to different groups, the folks living in the project and those in the surrounding suburban neighborhoods. The retailers have a problem. Do I sell garden supplies for the area around me, or do I, sell clothing oriented to the particular demographic in my group? So there are challenges as these properties continue. Now, but I think Belmar is a great example of just bringing in a street network and extending the existing streets. So really improving connectivity and again, capturing a lot of local trips that are now walk trips. So reducing auto dependency very well. But not every community is going to be able to retrofit and put in a whole bunch of streets. That's really expensive. This is a community near Atlanta that really, the town grew up around a 500-acre office park. And as the office park has been aging, they've had a really tough time. The tenants have had a hard time recruiting younger employees. It just, it's all sort of beautiful bermed landscape, and then, but it does not excite the younger employees. So the city said, all right, we have to attract the millennials. And so they tore down 2 of the older buildings and they put in what they actually called millennial housing. To me, it was a little insulting. It made it sound like gerbil housing or something. But it worked. And then they said, and millennials like to bike to work. We can put in trails. Trails are on fire in Atlanta. We have this little rails to trails called the Atlanta Beltline. It is now has the highest rents. We have bike-oriented development that is getting $50 a square foot on the Beltline that nobody else in Atlanta can get. So suddenly now all the suburbs are saying, well, we might not be able to do street networks, but we can do trails. So we are seeing, and it's working. It is now attracting a lot of, they're rehabbing a lot of the office they've built a new downtown, and they've even got a autonomous vehicle test track. So they're actually doing extremely well. So some of that gets to improving public health, because we know cars really hurt public health. And again, there's lots of different strategies and things. I'm going to just sort of jump right in. One of the really interesting trends that we've been seeing is increasingly a lot of the medical office districts have been organizing and retrofitting themselves to become health districts. And on the one hand, they've already had all the doctors and services, but they're often some of the most unhealthy places to actually be. They're not walkable. They're sort of lousy neighbors. And so Memphis Medical District is a really terrific example. There are several of them. But they are, on the one hand, doing the simple things like, okay, let's tame the street, make it more walkable, paint the plaza to make a little bit of a plaza and shorten the distance of the intersection crossing. They've done a lot of public art projects, planting lots and lots of trees and shrubs. And it's just that leveraging several hospitals and the medical office districts. They really, it's great to see them actually start to become healthy. Other examples, this was a former mall, the Landmark Mall in Alexandria, Virginia, which is now about to be anchored by a new, very large hospital. And really recognizing that hospitals don't need to necessarily be kind of isolated and lousy neighbors. They can actually be terrific neighbors and give people a lot, allow people to really combine multiple trips and all of those kinds of things, and even live near the hospital. There also, we see healthcare has been extremely strong use when it's going into the reinhabitation, in particular, of dead malls. So Jackson Medical Mall in Jackson, Mississippi, the entire mall is medical. 100 Oaks in Nashville is a great story of a 2-story mall where medical went in on the second floor, and the mall was dying, but now they give patients beepers. So the patients don't have to wait in a waiting room. They can go downstairs and check the sales. And now the retail's flourishing. So it's a real win-win for things. And I know you have the Marketplace Mall's former Sears is being replaced by University of Rochester Orthopedics Center. So we see this a lot. A lot of healthcare is taking advantage of some of these former retail spaces in particular. And last on the public health, this project really fascinates me. I think it's extremely well done for a variety of reasons. But in particular, because it took on the challenge of the loneliness epidemic. The Surgeon General back in 2017, current Surgeon General back in 2017 was interim, and he announced that the US was in a loneliness epidemic. Chronic loneliness is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of the impact on health. We know it particularly affects seniors and teenagers, especially those who cannot drive and are feeling trapped. And it's particularly prevalent in the suburbs, as we're just seeing it rise, especially during the pandemic and isolation. So in this project, which is the developer, Edens, is one of the country's largest owners and developers of grocery-anchored strip malls. But the new CEO decided, that might not be the future. I want to test doing a mixed-use town center. And she said she really resonated with this idea of people being lonely, and she thought especially suburban women. That's most of the clients that she's most concerned about who are shopping at grocery-anchored strip malls. So they did two things especially well at this, in this project. This is sort of the before and after figure grounds. But if you look at that drawing in the middle, you'll see that the ground floor is all very small little boutique shops and restaurants, about 25 feet wide, because that's how often we turn our heads when we're at walking speed on a street, and we know this. And so the very interactive, great streetscape. But above that, 2 levels of parking, and above that, the Target. You can see in the photograph next to it the escalators that take you up to the Target. Apparently it's doing phenomenally well. But their strategy was, we're going to put all the only do small stuff at the ground floor. The big stuff goes above. So they did the same strategy with office. They did the same strategy with their Cinemaplex, a number of things. This was a former Cinemaplex site. They also put in a town green. We see this in most mixed-use town centers. In the suburbs, people generally have plenty of access to seeing trees and green. What they really need is access to more people. They need access to each other. And so these town greens, the successful ones, need to be programmed constantly. So, and in this case, to encourage people to get out and use it. This is only a 1 acre, it's AstroTurf, but it's got a big LED screen on the side of the movie theater, which plays, that can project the yoga classes in the morning, the mom and toddler classes mid-morning, office workers stuff kind of at lunch, after school kids stuff, every local sports team game at night and or the movie nights. And it's an effort to just encourage people to get out of their house and come together, and gather. They also did a great job. There's just seating everywhere in this project. And phenomenally, it's an extremely successful project. We can't prove whether it's actually reducing loneliness, but I think it's a fascinating, great effort. Now, the next challenge is, and again, these all relate, but it's supporting an aging population. And in particular, the isolation of seniors in suburbia is really what sort of previous generations basically, how they often tried to sort of solve the issues of aging instead of accommodating them in their own homes. But there's so much, the boomers, we invented youth culture. We do not want to be isolated out if we can help it. So there's a lot of really great attempts now to really integrate senior housing into walkable neighborhoods. So you guys have one, not exactly fully integrated, but you have, I think, a great example of an adaptive reuse of a dead mall at Irondequoit, now Skyview Ridge, turning the department store into affordable housing, and then having senior housing as well with some new build on the parking lots, as well as health center and community centers. Really, I think doing, from what I hear, a really good job. I haven't been there. I hope many of you have. But again, integrating the seniors now with the health and community center is really terrific. Another example, this one is in Minnesota, in Wayzata, where a mall had been built on a former wetland. Its parking lot had been just dumping toxic runoff right into the lake for decades. When the mall died, it has now since been replaced with senior housing anchored mixed-use town center. So it's mostly senior housing, but there's also some shops, there's a hotel, there's a town actively programmed town green, and the whole thing has massive underground storage and tanks and things to make sure that there is not ever another drop of runoff going into the lake. It's a fabulous project. It sold out before it even finished construction, but it's expensive. This is an expensive place to live, and it extends, it connects to the downtown Main Street. It's really doing a lot of, I think, great. It really is knitted into the life of that community, but at a price. So some more affordable options, also in Minnesota on the left, is a former Days Inn motel that is now senior living. And it happens to be, it sits on an out parcel of a mall, so the seniors can walk to the mall, and it's across the street from the public library. The other example is a small office building that has been converted into co-housing. Almost all of the residents are seniors, and you can see the former parking court is now a garden court. There are lots and lots of these sort of examples. Still, one of my favorite strategies is to see the use of missing middle scale housing and allowing folks to really age in their same neighborhoods, but in smaller footprint homes that don't have all the same maintenance. So this is in the relatively affluent community of East Greenwich, Rhode Island, that decided they did need some affordable housing, and they picked the parking lot of the former next to the auto repair place. The first proposal, upper right there, came in as double loaded corridor, big hunker of a box laid down. Then they hired one of my former students who gave them this cottage court. I'm always proud. I'll always pump my students. And that's actually 15 units on 1 acre. That's pretty high density, especially for a village-like town, New England town. But it maintains the character of the street. It maintains, it's very cute and very, very, fits into the context. No one has complained about the affordable housing going in. Design matters, and it especially matters, I think, when you're doing affordable housing. So this gets us to the next topic, leveraging social capital for equity. And there's so many, I think, kind of issues here. And June and I were really very torn, because on the one hand, we could have broken this into 2 chapters and just had one that really focusing on how to build social capital and the need for all these programmed town greens that help get people to gather, and then the needs for equity and affordability. But we decided that actually talking about them together is incredibly useful because the suburbs have become increasingly fragmented. We have the rich suburbs are getting richer, the poor suburbs are getting poorer, the concentrations of poverty are absolutely out there, and there's so little interaction. So the strategies laid out here are certainly to re-inhabit a lot of buildings with social infrastructure. And there's just so many different kinds, but we just need more of this. Re-green underused spaces and let parks play a stronger role to help people gather. And then when we are redeveloping, to absolutely include affordable housing. So I'll show a number of examples. This woman here, Margie Stagmeyer, is one of my heroes. She's not very well known outside of Atlanta, although she just wrote a new book about what is some of the really phenomenal transformations. What she has managed suburban apartment complexes her entire career. What she now does and really focuses on is she buys, so that, apartment complexes like that upper right, usually about 300 units. These are no one's idea of terrific urbanism, terrific design. A lot of them, they're aging, they're often moldy, some of them are extremely unhealthy, but they are the housing of last resort and the only affordable housing option out there for enormous a number of people. And they're falling down. We need to preserve at least what affordable housing we have. And so that's what Margie does. She targets the sort of these aging complexes that are in the worst performing elementary school districts, and recognizes that there's a connection because she knows that most of the tenants are single moms. They're often working $10 an hour jobs down at the Atlanta airport. If a kid gets sick, they miss a shift, they lose their job, they move, and they're on a rotation amongst these different apartment complexes. Every time they move, their kids miss, on average, 3 months of school. And that's such a constant rotation. The schools are typically having only 30% of the students at the end of the year were there at the beginning of the year. So what she does, one little change, she takes one unit and makes it an after-school program. The kids start to get to know each other. Through the kids, the parents get to know each other. They cover for each other. Suddenly, she's got stability. She does not have vacancy and the constant churn. And the schools, after 5 years, are amongst the top performing in how much they've improved. And really, there's a lot more to it, but it's such an incredible transformation. And there's so much need out there to really pull more people into it. And I think some of that, the social capital is, in fact, she initially just drew on her own church to help man the after-school program. She now has a network of volunteers, and it really helped to build a sense of community that is very tangible, with tangible results. This is Wyandanch, New York, on Long Island. It has been considered the most economically distressed community on Long Island. It is historically a black community. It was when Levittown would not allow any non-whites to move in. The only choice they had was Wyandanch. It didn't have suburbs until sewers, until this project came in. What it did have was a train station on the Long Island Railroad, but it was just a big park and ride, not really used. It was being used, but not as much. They've now built a parking garage, built a town center at the train station, and being built with local labor, they've now are programming their town green, they're building social capital, and this is just phase one. There are many more phases to come. So seeing investments in these lower income suburbs is extremely important, not easy. It took an enormous number of meetings and coalition building. The distrust was extremely high that anything was really going to come out of it, and it has since been absolutely embraced. But it's not easy to do. There, simpler things to do, though, are things like this project. Down in Fayetteville, Arkansas, a former grocery store had a blank wall to the main street. When a new co-op came in to take over, that blank wall, they turned into a beach with hammocks and twinkle lights, and it's right off of the coffee shop. So they created a fabulous gathering space right on the main street, and very cheap, inexpensive, but also, really establishing a sense of community and presence. This is an example of a strip mall that downsized, recognized that, hey, retail's kind of not doing quite so well. So they dramatically downsized the strip mall and put in housing, because there's tremendous need for housing. But what they also did was suddenly now the strip mall happened to back up to a major park. That's where their truck dock was. Now the housing is actually all oriented to and connected to the park. And we're seeing this in a lot of strip malls where suddenly the back is now being made into another front. And that just completely sort of transforms the access and more eyes on the park and all sorts of useful things. This is one of my favorite projects. I was sort of, again, pulling on that theme of education from the little after-school program. This is an example of a community college, Austin Community College, moving in and completely re-inhabiting a dead mall in Austin. And then what they also did was they partnered with a developer who then is building office and residential on top of the parking lots. And they kept a few little green quads and little parks, so there's some historic pieces in that. They keep building on this. It's, I think, a really terrific project. My favorite little detail is that the developer, in the leasing agreements, when he can, with the new office tenants, is he requires them to hire a certain number of interns from the community college. And those are always great kind of things to see. Totally at the other end, though, in terms of the simplest thing, this is 2 blocks from my home. And I'm a cat person. I am not a dog person, but I will go out of my way just to watch the dogs teach us how to build community. Dogs know how to do this better than we do. So this is just, it had been an abandoned lot for 20 years. And then the new owners laid down some AstroTurf and brought in an Airstream trailer that is the bark. And then also built another one for a coffee shop. So it's, you can get booze or coffee while the dog, and just be entertained by the dogs. It is an empire now. This was their first, and now they're going national. But it's so simple and really phenomenal. Even more just wacko. Who thought of this? I do not know. I'd like to know the person who thought of this. I bet they're really fun. Crystal City in Arlington, Virginia, is one of the most, to me, kind of, it's an office park above an underground mall. It's just combining like boringness to a level that's pretty awful. But it is where Amazon H2Q is coming. And yet the Community Improvement District, or Business Improvement District in this case, has these monthly bicycle races in the parking garage. And as you can see, people are having a really good time. So, I mean, we can't, there's no end to the creativity of how do we really start building for more social capital, making use of our spaces in ways that can help all people come together and laugh and have a good time. So this gets to the challenge of competing for jobs. You know, we need to design for tomorrow's workers, not today's. And as someone teaching in universities now for a very long time, but I will tell you, they're different. The younger generations, and especially I think the generations that never got to have a prom because of COVID, missed out on so many different sort of rituals. From what I can see, Gen Z want in-person jobs and flexible hours. They crave both vibrant gathering spaces, but they also are kind of nervous, and they do want really protective private space. They insist on inclusivity, and they are the first majority-minority generation. And they desperately need affordability. They are still most likely to be extremely saddled in debt unless we can figure that out. So there are a lot of different aspects to this sort of how the suburbs have, I mean, more than 85% of jobs are out in the suburbs. That's been true for quite some time. And the suburbs right now, the downtowns are struggling, the suburbs are not struggling at quite as much office in the suburbs, but there's still a lot of different new trends kind of happening. So, and one of the trends is that as the malls are dying, main streets are coming back with lots of small entrepreneurial businesses. There's been an explosion since COVID, especially, of sort of entrepreneurial businesses. This is an example in Ohio, outside of Cincinnati, where a little 3-block historic Main Street was dead. It was mostly vacant. And a community group started targeting the food truck operators and saying, are you getting tired of driving around? Do you want a brick and mortar location too? Which was a brilliant strategy, and it worked. And they also found out that at least in Ohio, if you get designated as a community entertainment district, that means you can have the open liquor law, and getting the cost of a liquor license is, instead of $25,000, is $2,500. So something that absolutely worked. They have refilled their little historic suburban downtown. And part of, I mean, another example of just revitalizing a suburban downtown is this example, well known. I love this project. The Boulevard in Lancaster, California is about 2 hours outside of LA in Antelope Valley. The before image shows, it was really 4 travel lanes with a turn lane, making it 5. And it was posted at 45 miles an hour. The thinking at the time was, well, our retail is dying, but this will make it easier for people to get to the retail. No, it just made it easier to zip right past it. So then they did the opposite. They put their Main Street on a road diet. They went down from the 5 lanes to 2, put the parking in the middle, in between street trees and street lights. they've got a lot more shade, which is really important out in the desert, permeable pavers under there. You'd think this would be a disaster, right? They did this for 9 blocks. Oh, and they got rid of the traffic lights at all 9 intersections. It's actually, when you're going 50 miles an hour, cars have to be far apart. When you're going 20 miles, they reduce the speed to 20. When you're going 20 miles, the cars can pretty much almost be bumper to bumper. You actually get more throughput at the slower speed, and people can actually see, oh, there's a sale at so-and-so's, pull into the parking. And it's safer, you've got more pedestrians, can walk across the street, shop on both sides. This has been a fantastically successful and really is a great project. I went out and interviewed a woman in her shop, and she's like, oh, the mall keeps wanting me back. No, I want to be here. This is it. So great opportunities to revive and the jobs. I mean, grow jobs, local jobs, right in the local main street. It's really important, I think, to think small sometimes. Nashville has these are 2 projects. They've now, I think, got about 6 of these. Little infill, local micro retail inserted into residential neighborhoods, often kind of at a major intersection, but really at the size and scale of a suburban residential lot. And then you're just getting these tiny little micro shops, some of them services shops, bringing they're really fantastically popular. And it being Nashville, the one also has a big party music pavilion in the middle of the block. But it's increasing walk score, which also then increases the property values, but it's really providing that kind of gathering space inside residential neighborhoods. And it's just made now, East Nashville is known to be now super hip, and it's not really that all of it is, but it has these little moments that make a big difference. So part of also, I think, giving more space, being deliberate about chasing your local entrepreneurs, not just trying to bring in chain retail, has a lot to do with really the successful jobs, helping you really compete for jobs. This is an example of an old Ames hardware store in a strip mall that the developer went in, and Monty Anderson is a terrific incremental development guy. So he worked out a deal with the mayor. He said, look, Mr. Mayor, I will chop the space up into 100 little stalls, but your office has to do the mentoring and help all these new young entrepreneurs really figure out how to run their businesses. And he took out 1 bay of the parking lot and put in some Airstream trailers, and he hopes to build some housing on there. But in the meantime, it's been very successful at just starting a culture and mentoring local entrepreneurs. They have a pitch day very frequently run by the city that helping people to pitch their ideas, and the winners get to open up a space. Not exactly the same thing, but similar concept. This is an example in Atlanta that I visit very frequently. Plaza Fiesta was a mall, and the newer owners converted one of the junior department stores into essentially a Mexican mercado. It's 140 little, basically 10-foot by 10-foot stalls, run by 140 mostly new immigrants. And it is, the owners say they're getting double the rent that they would have gotten from a junior anchor, but it's also now become this fantastic community hub. They have big concerts whenever there's any kind of anti-immigrant legislation. which happens in Georgia too often, the rallies are held here. And that's the true sign of public space. If you draw a protest, you've made public space. So it's actually private space, but it's acting like public space. Really, so, the jobs, on the one hand, so I'm emphasizing the importance of sort of local entrepreneur jobs, but the other side of it is we are just seeing so many of the older office parks. I've got about 150 that I'm tracking in my database. This is one that's been around the longest and has gotten the furthest along. This was a former IBM 300-acre R&D campus. It has since gone through several phases of redevelopment. And the basic strategy is really pretty simple. So the far diagram there, in black, are all the existing roads of the office park. And they're wide and very car-oriented, as you sort of see. So they're the B streets. But then they inserted in red these much more walkable, the A streets, lined with a lot of retail, a lot of restaurants, a lot of apartments. And so you can sort of see here the B street and then the new walkable A street. And now Amazon, Facebook, Google are building 18-story towers attracted by the urbanism of this project domain. So they market themselves as Austin's second downtown. But I think that strategy of sort of how to infill an office park with inserting the A streets to break up the blocks, make it more walkable, is really extremely successful. Now, if my Georgia Tech students, if any of them have to work in an office park, this is the one they would like to work at. This is called Taxi. It was a former taxi distribution center, so it's where the taxis went at night, and the auto body repair and the radio tower. Today, it's about just 3 miles outside of the downtown in the Rhino area, River North. It is the most anti-corporate version of an office park possible. Literally at the groundbreaking, they burned a cubicle. So they had the auto body repair, they renovated that, and of course it had the glass garage doors. So then as they built more new buildings, they also gave every single live unit, every work unit gets the operable glass doors. And again, they're kind of thumbing their nose at the glass. Who wants to work in that totally glass enclosed office tower? You can't open the windows. This place did great during the pandemic. And it's attracted all of the new startups. It's really, it thrives on, I think, trying to inculcate a sense of authenticity. So even some of the old parking lot is there, and they still repaint and stripe to keep it. They're honoring their past in many ways. There's a lot I could say on this, but I'm going on too long. Final challenge: climate change. And I know that Rochester, like Atlanta actually, is one of the cities that is probably likely to be on the receiving end of climate refugees. And we all really need to think about, what is the social contract we are willing to make? How do we prepare for climate refugees coming in? So that's one topic on climate. But really what the book is mostly about is adding water and energy resilience. And this image of Philadelphia's historic streams before and after suburbanization just makes me cry. Why are we having problems with more severe storms? Why are we having so much flooding? That's why. We've culverted all of our creeks. We've paved things over. So the water issues, luckily, there's actually a lot of great things we're doing to improve water quality, to deal with too little or too much water. I don't see nearly enough retrofits really dealing with energy. It's just so much easier if you're dealing with putting in energy districts and really trying to work in renewables. It's just a lot easier with new build construction than to retrofit, but there is some, but not as much. There's a lot more on the water. So this is a stormwater park in Connecticut. Again, a mall was built on top of a creek. That's kind of what we did. It's right in downtown, working class Meriden, Connecticut. The pipes failed. It flooded their downtown repeatedly. And so they finally tore down the mall, daylit the creek. You can see they removed the culverts, daylit the creek. And then the park is shaped kind of like a bathtub. So during dry weather, it's a grassy green park, but it is absolutely designed to look like exactly what that in that slide, where it fills with water. It removes over 200 downtown properties out of the floodplain, including the new train station, the new public housing, and a bunch of other things. In Atlanta, we did a similar thing, but whereas that one was a dry, we did a wet version of a stormwater park. We had 17 acres of parking lots that is today it is today a really great stormwater park that was designed as really, it's a combined sewer overflow retention. So I've seen weddings held at this sewer retention pond. I mean, they really did, it's a beautiful, it again is designed like a bathtub. Generally, the water level is down really low. And you'd think that'd make for a kind of lousy, awkward park. It's actually wonderful. When you go down, and you can walk down, roll down there, the sound of the city just goes away. And you just hear quack, chirp, quack, you know, you just hear it's really quite wonderful. And it cost half the price of doing an underground tunnel. And why would you do an underground tunnel to save the parking lots? No, give us a park. It's actually been so successful that now there's concerns about gentrification. And that's combined really with what else is around it. Last example, I haven't shown much residential properties getting changed because it doesn't happen much. Most of suburban retrofitting is on the commercial properties. But this is a terrific example, started in Maplewood, Minnesota, where they just, as a part of their ordinary maintenance of residential streets, when they have to repave the street, they narrow it. That slows the traffic, which is good, gives them room to put in sidewalks that they didn't have before, and they put in rain gardens. The rain gardens cleanse the storm water before it goes into the sewers and then into the creeks. Phenomenally successful. It's not cheap, but it is actually part of that routine maintenance and has now inspired rain garden movements in many other cities and is happening all over the place. So very last slide. How do you get the development you want and frankly need? And I wish, I can show all these examples. I've shown all these examples. I hope some of them will stick and be useful in some way. I never know exactly what will be useful. But Bill asked me this question before I came, help us figure out how do we get the development we really want? And my answer is, you have to make it easy for developers to do the right thing, and you also have to make it harder to build sprawl. Neither of those are particularly easy, but they're not impossible either. And I think the most important way to try to do that is looking at all these challenges and pick which ones are the more important ones in your communities, and you can add new challenges. But finding challenges that you can build really broad coalitions around, so that it's, change is because you need to have a lot of public support in order to be able to really go after the shared funding, to go and to demand that the policies and regulations really be updated. And that they need to strengthen where you're trying to conserve or repair the ecological infrastructure and not allow more sprawl, and where you want to target urban redevelopment. That is really one of actually, not sort of saying, okay, everybody just make urbanism all over. No, target. You really need relatively small, but some strategically located great urbanism that will succeed and then can grow. In addition, I would certainly recommend enhancing public spaces with programming and placemaking. Rely less on retail to activate them. I'd say 10 years ago, I would have absolutely been advocating, and you got to get a lot of ground floor retail to activate. Retail isn't, you're not going to be able to, there just aren't, there isn't as much retail out there now. But you can program public spaces. We can do a lot more. We don't have to only rely on retail. I would also encourage you to focus that much more on re-inhabiting and re-greening existing buildings and centers. Don't assume that redevelopment is really always and only the best strategy. Think small and enable local entrepreneurs. And I think your downtown has seen some great growth, but it still needs to really prove the market for urban living. In general, the suburbs and the bankers aren't going to lend on projects kind of out in the suburbs for urbanism. They don't quite believe it, and the developers too, until they've seen it be successful in the downtown. And it seems like you guys are, if you're not there, you're really close to being there. So bravo and go for it. And thank you for allowing me to show you not quite 2,000 case studies. Thank you.
I think we have time for a few questions for Ellen. Ellen, that was so wonderful. Thank you. It's so wonderful to see everybody here. I'll bring this microphone over to you.
So I know you were touching on it a little bit toward the end of the presentation, how many of the studies have been involved or have involved looking at dead or dying malls. Recently, I've been reading a lot of articles where there's this interesting position where people understand that we're looking for affordable housing, but then when it comes towards implementing it in their own neighborhoods, it starts to take a different turn. With the amount of pressure that's building up, that's been built into the zoning codes, have you seen some retrofits of sort of suburban tracts of residential housing that have started to embrace a little bit more of a density and finding ways to create placemaking as part of a solution and building in some of those environmental aspects? I know it's a big question.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if I understand, your question is really within the residential areas, am I seeing any change?
Correct, especially as we start talking about housing and the demand for that.
Certainly, accessory dwelling units have been very much on the rise in a lot of places. In Los Angeles, it's just amazing how many accessory dwelling units have been built very rapidly because there's such a crisis. And once they finally figured out how to get the legislation, the ordinance written in a way that truly allows them, boom, the ADUs took off. We've been really frustrated in Atlanta because we have an ordinance, and yet it's still really hard to do. So we're trying to get folks, look at how LA did it. There are occasional examples, not many, but where, I know of one case in Northern Virginia when a new subway station opened up, a developer, Pulte Homes, big home builder, went and knocked on 60 doors and offered everybody double their appraised value. Everybody sold. And now they're built up a whole bunch of apartments. I know of an example of a homeowners association that also saw that people were trying to buy, and so they organized collectively and just said, all right, we're selling out. And we're going to collectively bargain for the most money. So that happens on occasion, but not much. Residential fabric is pretty static. It just doesn't tend to change a lot. But it's at the edges along the corridors. That's where one sees tremendous new apartment, a lot of apartment construction, condos, and it's generally going to be along those corridors. And that's not uncommon at all.
Thanks. Is it okay if I do one more before I hand it? Or I don't want to take from. Are there any legal strategies you see towards greening previously places?
Legal strategies for redeveloping.
Re-greening.
Oh, re-greening. Oh man, I wish. There are plenty of places where a community has been badly flooded, and then literally the public sector buys up the homes that were flooded and turns them into a park. There are a couple of cool examples of entire golf courses. Golf is kind of dying. It's expensive and kind of aging out. So there are golf courses that have been turned into stormwater parks as well. But as far as legal, EPA, 2007, the Environmental Protection Agency made a very significant rule change that more or less means that in most parts of the country now, every property owner for new construction must accommodate the first inch of rainwater on their site. And that's driving a lot. On the one hand, it's great. On the other hand, it's actually encouraging a certain amount of sprawl because developers need more land to be able to do that. And there's been a lot of talk about setting up stormwater utilities so that you can gather. That's what these stormwater parks are doing, is they're suddenly now, that's how you're allowing collectively, we're going to now have 300 acres that is all being, all of that rainwater is coming into this one location. But otherwise, I see a lot of places that are really being stalled. Developers want to do some redevelopment, and it's the stormwater rules that are making it tough to do. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I've got the microphone. I apologize. I'm going to hold it for 1 second, then I'll pass it back. So in your experience in communities that have seen a growth in especially rental unit-based housing, are those in places where they already had a high percentage of, or at least a more significant percentage of rental units compared to traditional suburbs in our area that are often more associated with owner-occupied? And how do you see that transition happening from accepting sort of that rental is not the end of the universe?
I try to always, when I get the chance, I try to make it as personal as possible. And I talk to the folks who are opposing it and saying, did you ever rent? When you first got out of, have you ever rented in your life? Oh yeah, blah, blah, blah. Do your children, when they come out, do you expect your children to buy a house the minute they move out of yours, or do you expect them to rent? And trying to make a little bit, that sometimes at least helps the conversation. Renters have such there is definitely a stigma to, oh, they don't contribute, they don't take care of their places, blah, 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 blah. What's also really, I think, is not recognized is that for the amount of people that are living in multifamily rentals in suburbia, you have just as many living in single-family houses as rentals. And yet, those are not regulated in the same way. Those are now increasingly being bought up by the private equity funds, and we're seeing they are the ones who are really not maintaining them in a lot of ways. So there's all sorts of issues there, but I do think trying to just talk about it in terms of our kids is a useful way of saying, did you rent? Did you destroy the community when you rented?
So I was lucky enough to get a hold of the microphone now. You mentioned that our community is likely to be on the receiving end of climate refugees, which does seem like a very safe assumption at this point in history. I'm wondering, a couple related things. What, in your opinion, does proactive planning for something like that look like? Is there anywhere in the country that you know of that's doing that well? And actually, I forgot what the third part was. So, just that.
Well, 2 is all I can handle it anyway. So, I know of a lot of discussion, but not a lot of actual planning that is going on. There are some people who I think feel that what is going to happen is going to be extremely chaotic, because it's going to be, suddenly a hurricane wipes out a community, and those people just have to move immediately, and they're going to be very desperate, and so that communities are going to wall themselves off, and we're going to have more gates and that kind of thing. Other people argue, something like sea level rise, it's really incremental, and it's going to give time for things to happen a little bit more gently and to better plan. I would think, though, that in communities where if growth is desired, this is an opportunity to actually plan ahead and welcome and try to really, make sure, say, hey, we have clean water and lots of access to a lot of it, and this is super important. That there are things to value in your community that may not always have been the way that you marketed your community. I know Atlanta is not preparing for climate change. We're kind of in a boom. We're seeing a lot of new growth, and unfortunately, most of it is taking the form of just more sprawl. My job will never be done. My work will never be done, because we're just building more and more of it. But it's because so many of the closer in-town places do not want any, they just don't want any change. It's not that they're opposed to newcomers, but they definitely don't want to see change. So I think it's just, we have to start those conversations. I don't think we're there yet. There is within Congress for the New Urbanism, there have been some of the it's been really led by the younger generation who are extremely interested in these questions and really trying to rank which communities have what opportunities to really benefit from climate refugees. So I think this gentleman's been waiting for the mic for a long time, and he's finally got it, so hello.
Hi. So a lot of the suburbs around here actually do have sort of a dense nucleus, like our ports and our fords, Pittsford and Fairport and Spencerport, where it grew up along the canal and it has like a little dense downtown and then a bunch of sprawl around it. Looks like most of the examples you were talking about happened near office parks and things like that were sort of sprawl from their inception. Do you have any examples or ways that some of these things interact with these town centers? Is there a way to revitalize them or to expand them or to shrink closer to them?
I did try to show some of those, a couple of examples of the revitalizing of those where the good bones certainly already are. I think it's really what's especially important there is, to see, again, it's kind of the history of, so much of the history of suburbia is that so many of those little old downtown main streets, when the malls came in the 70s, just devastated them. They're lucky if they had a couple of antique stores kind of taking over. It's not automatic that as the mall dies, suddenly Main Street comes back. There has to be a local organization that just takes that on. But that is happening in just a lot of places. And so there's both brand new, not retrofits, but just new communities that have main streets and things. But there is also a lot of this revitalization. One of the programs that works extremely well in Atlanta is that our MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, siphons off about 5% of all the transportation money that comes to Metro Atlanta. 5% of it, goes into planning grants for that anyone in any community in the region can say, hey, we'd like to try to reduce car dependency right here. And then if they get the grant, then if they produce a good plan, they then compete for the implementation funds. And it's almost 200 communities now have just done that little acupuncture that's needed here, there, in various places. Almost all, much of it has been to really help the old historic main streets really come back and really not just come back, but really thrive. It's pretty shocking in some respects. I would say in Atlanta, the tipping point, when I first moved there, 2000, the downtown was still looking at what the suburbs were doing and was emulating anything kind of new in the burbs. Was like, well, we can do that. Bad. And I would say it's now, maybe, 7, 8 years ago, total flip. The suburbs are suddenly like, well, we want a food hall like they've got. We want trails like they've got. We want innovation districts like they've got. And it's just we reached a tipping point. And I do think some of it was when, in particular, the jobs along the trails. That has been, MailChimp is a pretty big high-tech company that outgrew its office right on the Beltline Trail. They polled their employees. They found that 30% were arriving by walk or bike. It shocked them. They had no idea that was actually happening. So now they've outgrown, they've got a couple thousand people, and so they've moved to a brand new building that they built on the Beltline, and they put in a hell of a lot less parking. So there are, that kind of got people's attention, I think.
So we talked about how a lot of these developments have increased property values, and that sounds great. we also talked about how for going on 20 years, most of our people in poverty are actually in the suburbs. How is this helping those people if property values are going up, or are we seeing suburban gentrification?
So there's always, there's always the tension, obviously, right in there. And this is where one needs to marry design and policy. If you just do one and not the other, it fails. If you only do the policy, you get crappy places. That's where the poverty is going to be. If you only do the design and you make a gorgeous, beautiful place, but you don't have some anti-displacement measures, then you are going to see you are likely to see displacement. The challenge is that we still really, one of my pet peeves is that I feel a lot of my colleagues in planning, we more or less, there's not total consensus, but more or less, we agree that to measure gentrification, if an area has become more educated, whiter, and more affluent, ergo it has gentrified. But then people just go, and ergo there's been displacement. Well, yeah, we know there's been people moving, but we don't really know how many people, if it was a lot of renters, if those renters on average were moving every 2 years anyway. We don't know how many of those people you can actually say were displaced. We don't know how many homeowners were aging, ready to move into some sort of a facility that finally now they could afford because they were selling their house at a good price. There's so much we don't know. We do not have good tools to actually measure displacement. So anyway, that's sort of the pet peeve. It's not to say it's not happening, and it is a huge issue and a huge problem where it is happening significantly. But a lot of the research actually shows people are more afraid of it than actually how often displacement is actually occurring. So.
Thank you. I'm curious about your metrics. When you talk about programming, and you have for a success policy, or if you're talking about road diets, how do you, normally when you go there, people will say their immediate reaction is we can't afford it. The same thing as filling in an inner loop, can't afford it. What are the metrics that you've seen work? Like talking about programming, if you're investing in programming, what is the return? And not just return dollar-wise, but there are other metrics. Like in the Inner Loop East, we measure, the only metric that we've come up with at this point that's talked about nationally is the amount of money that was invested by the city, the state, et cetera, and what has been by development. So what other kind of metrics have you found, and how can we use them? So, 2 things, one for programming, one for road diet, and another for how do you do the inner loop type of thing.
All right, I'll start. You're going to probably have to remind me. That's 3 things. I can only do 2. Remember 2. But so for programming is actually fairly easy. I know the folks that are doing the programming count how many programs and how many attendees, and then are also able to then look at receipts in the restaurants, look at various things. But one project I didn't show, but it's in the book, is Guthrie Green, is a regreening of a truck dock, just a little 2.5 acre. It's now a heavily programmed park, and it was mostly built by a foundation. And part of what they did that was pretty clever is as they depaved this old truck dock, they put in geothermal wells, a whole lot of them. The geothermal wells are providing free heating to the group that are in charge of programming that park. So they've literally designed into it a way of paying for the cost of someone doing the programming. And it doesn't hurt that there's a foundation with really big, deep pockets helping to make all that happen, and that is counting doing that. I think the foundation is the one really doing a lot of the counting on that one. So you could look up to see some of their more specific. Their website shows a lot of. They're particularly interested in the health side of the activities around the park. But I think a great metric in general is just looking at property tax on a per acre basis. That's been a really interesting metric that Joe Minicozzi and his group Urban 3 have developed to look at, on the one hand, suburbs versus cities, and there's a lot of expectation that folks have that assuming that, well, the suburbs are wealthier per capita, so the suburbs are subsidizing the city. No, absolutely not. And it's really clear when you look at that metric. In fact, analyses have been done that Mar-a-Lago, the property tax on a per acre basis is less at Mar-a-Lago than for the maid who works there. And we see this all the time. Property taxes tend to be extremely regressive because wealthy folks can hire lawyers to fight them, and the lower income folks don't.
So does anyone
those are
have
just
any?
two. On road diets, it's really looking at the traffic counts, how many minutes, and there's lots of studies that measure how much longer does it take the car to go down it now that it has a road diet, and mostly finding that it's so minuscule. It's just not enough compared to the rest of the economic development that you see as a result, and the safety numbers. So tracking accidents, and one of the more disappointing things is that road diets that have been putting in bike lanes we see an increase in the crash of cyclists. So even though we are making more bike lanes and making it easier for people to bike around, we are also seeing more accidents.
I was struck by the photograph you showed of the Fourth Ward Park in Atlanta several slides back. And unusually, that body of water was depressed from the surrounding land. Mm-hmm. And you indicated that that's much more appealing to people. It creates its own world. We have a somewhat similar situation here in Rochester, where it's not been built yet, but the city planning is going ahead with cantilevered walkways about 25 feet above the water level, and I'm speaking about from the Main Street Bridge south to the aqueduct, and even further south, they have already built such a very expensive cantilevered walkway. I've been advocating that instead they go right down to the water level for a river walk, which, like you were saying, when you're at the water level, it's a different world. You hear the sounds of the water instead of the sounds of traffic. And at that level, the angle of reflection of the sky is a much smaller angle, and the river looks blue, unlike the present brown that you see for the river when you're looking down. And the objection that they give is that, well, it's flooded some of the time. Mm-hmm. Well, that's true in cities throughout the world. Paris and elsewhere, they just take a hose and wash the silt off, and a lot of the time it's a great spot. So I'm wondering if you could suggest some insights that would help the community better see the advantage of what you have achieved in Atlanta.
Come on down. I mean, it might be that, it is rather astonishing to me. They even hired artists so that where the pipes are coming in, the sewer pipes are coming, they made it very sculptural. And they spent a lot more money than what one would expect for a sewer project, but it was still half the cost of had it been an underground tunnel. So I guess that's how they somehow kind of justified it, and it was part of this new park. So they really did make it a very beautiful But it's still, it's still not that blue. It's still kind of brown.
Ellen, on behalf of the board and everybody here tonight, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay, everybody, so thank you so much for coming out tonight. Please tell your friends and colleagues and neighbors. In March 9th, 1 month from today, we're going to have Dr. Norm Garrick. Norm was here almost a decade ago also, and we'll be focusing on transportation and the intersection of transportation and land use. We look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you so much. Yes, come see him.